Yves Saint Laurent understood women. When it came to where their needs met their style, it was almost a supernatural gift. From his time in the military to his time in and out of hospitals, he knew what it was like to be forced into a uniform or a gown, having your dignity and identity stripped away. So when he stepped out onto his own into the world of fashion, his immediate goal was to help women feel confident, comfortable, and stylish. Yves was born in Algeria to French parents, grew up on the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. He was the only boy in his family, being raised with two younger sisters. Together, they would play along the shores, instilling in Yves an appreciation for the elegance of natural beauty. As a child, he preferred to play with dolls alongside his sisters, designing clothes and dresses for them. This would lead to ridicule later in life, but as a child, his mother embraced and encouraged his creativity, and by his early teen years, he was designing dresses for the women in his family. Yves was a very talented designer, even without being classically trained. In 1953, Saint Laurent submitted 3 sketches to a contest for young fashion designers organized by the International Wool Secretariat, and the young man won first place. Upon winning the contest, he was invited to attend the award ceremony held in Paris in December later that year. During this trip, he met Michael de Brunhoff, who at that time was editor-in-chief of the French edition of Vogue magazine. Michael de Brunhoff was known to encourage and cultivate new up-and-coming talent. Yves showed him a few of his sketches, and the fashion journalist was immediately impressed. He suggested that Yves consider becoming a fashion designer. "I've never in my life met anyone more gifted," de Brunhoff later wrote to Edmond Charleroux, his successor at Vogue. Michael recommended that he come to the city and see what the world of fashion could offer. Yves was quick to comply, as his trip for the award ceremony had given him a taste of the highlight. He wanted nothing more than to be in a place that not only appreciated but craved his work. So at the age of 18, he decided to move to Paris and see what kind of life he could build in the big city. Michael was insistent that Yves study fashion and try his hand at designing professionally. Eventually, young Saint Laurent relented and joined the fashion community. He settled on a course of study at the Chambre syndicale de la haute couture, council which regulates the haute couture industry and provides training to its employees. He began his studies there in 1954 and eventually graduated as a star pupil. While studying with the Chambre, he began gaining instant recognition among designers and fashion houses. Even before finishing his studies, the name of Yves Saint Laurent was making waves in the design world. Michael de Brunhoff continued to keep a watchful eye on the young fashion student. The two of them developed a bit of a friendship. Yves continued to show Michael his new design ideas, and Michael, being a professional critic of the industry, would offer his input. It was this relationship that led to Yves being introduced to his future mentor. One day, Yves brought Michael a set of designs that looked remarkably similar to something Christian Dior had shown him earlier that day. Knowing that Dior had created the sketches that morning and that there was no way that Yves could have seen them, Michael sent him straight to Dior. The elite designer took one look at the sketches Yves had made and hired him on the spot. Dior saw the talent and potential in Yves immediately, but he chose to start the young man at the bottom. He reasoned that such a talented designer should have an understanding and respect for the industry from the ground up. He did not want Yves' natural skill to expand his ego and cause him to make rash and costly mistakes. So for the first year that he worked for the House of Dior, Yves found himself working on rather mundane tasks, such as decorating the studio and designing accessories. In time, Christian allowed the burgeoning designer to submit sketches for the couture line. Over the next 2 years, Yves flourished under the tutelage of Christian Dior. It seemed like with each passing day, more and more of his sketches were being accepted, and his designs quickly became popular with the clientele. Where Yves had the talent, Dior poured into him his understanding of the people and his ability to read their needs and desires without being told. In August 1957, Dior met with Yves' mother to tell her that he had chosen her son to succeed him as lead designer of the House of Dior. Mrs. Saint Laurent later said that she had been confused by the remark, as Christian Dior was only 52 years old at the time. However, her confusion did not take away from her excitement. Her only son was going to sit at the head of the table at one of the most influential fashion houses in the world. Later in 1957, Christian Dior would pass away from a sudden heart attack, having just barely appointed his successor before taking his leave. Yves Saint Laurent found himself at age 21 the head designer of the House of Dior. He immediately set about changing and modernizing the brand. His spring collection in 1958 almost certainly saved the fashion house from financial collapse. The simple, flaring lines of his first collection for Dior, called the Trapeze line, a variation of Dior's 1955 A line, launched him into the spotlight. Dresses in the collection featured a narrow shoulder that flared gently to a hem that just covered the knee, giving subtle indication for the direction Yves would be taking fashion in the coming decades. The Trapeze line firmly established Yves as the rightful heir to the throne of Dior. Yves would find his time of comfort and luxury would be short-lived, however. In 1960, he found himself conscripted to serve in the French army during the Algerian War. Nira Kara writes that there was speculation at the time that Marcel Broussard, the owner of the House of Dior and a powerful press baron, had put pressure on the government not to conscript the fashion designer in 1958 and 1959, but after the lackluster performance of the 1958 fall line, changed his mind and asked that the designer be conscripted. The rumor was that Broussard wanted Yves replaced and assumed that if the young man were sent off to serve in the military, the path would be clear for him to appoint his own leadership. This turned out to be only partially true. Yves was in the military for 20 days. After 3 weeks of service, Yves had been hazed and tortured by his fellow soldiers to the point of hospitalization. He was admitted to a military hospital, and it was here that he received the news that he had been fired from Dior. He was to be replaced by Marc Bohan. This only made his condition worse, and he was subsequently transferred to Val-de-Grâce Military Hospital, where he was treated with large doses of sedatives and psychoactive drugs and was subjected to various aggressive treatments, such as electroshock therapy. Yves would later claim that it was this particular hospital stay that began his unfortunate history with poor mental health and substance abuse. The entire situation devastated Yves. He felt so hurt and betrayed by the brand he had dedicated the last 4 years of his life to. Christian Dior himself had handpicked Yves to be his successor, and the fashion house was ready to move on from him as if he were no one. In time, Yves' condition improved, and he was well enough to return home. After being released from the hospital, he set about suing Dior for breach of contract and quickly won their case. Yves was determined not to repeat his situation with Dior ever again. He had been snubbed by a brand that he had brought back from the brink of collapse and had been treated with no loyalty. The powers that be had worked behind his back to remove him and take his work for themselves. Yves realized that the only way to prevent this from happening again was to go into business for himself. Taking the money from the suit, as well as investments from American millionaire J. Mac Robinson, Yves and romantic partner Pierre Berger had started his own fashion house. As he founded his brand, he began to reflect on his customer base. He realized he had more in common with the women who purchased his clothes than the men in the boardroom at Dior. He'd been hazed and ridiculed all his life, put down and abused by men. He was different, more effeminate in his tastes, rather enjoying things considered unmanly. Most importantly, he felt he understood what it meant to exist in a system that was not designed for you. To have to carve out a space for yourself, knowing the wider world did not care how talented or gifted you were. Yves felt a connection with the women who purchased his designs and decided it would not be style, fashion, or even profits that would be the focus. The focus of the house of Yves Saint Laurent would be women. The fashion world had let him down before, but the women he sold to never would. The 1960s and 70s were a flurry of activity for Yves. He's often credited with making it more acceptable for women to wear pants. His new mindset was to help women feel more comfortable and powerful without spending a fortune on a design. Yves marketed his brand to the middle class as well as the upper class woman, and his plan worked better than anyone could have expected. YSL became incredibly popular almost overnight. He brought nothing but his name with him when he founded his fashion house, and it turned out that was all he needed. His time at Dior had garnered him a reputation as a designer to watch, and his groundbreaking new work was bringing in new fans of YSL nearly every day. He opened his pret-a-porter house, YSL Rive Gauche, in 1967, and it was this change where he made the shift from haute couture to ready-to-wear. The YSL brand was the first couturier that released a ready-to-wear line. When the other houses saw the success of the line, they quickly followed suit. Meeting the needs and desires of the wider fashion world established Yves as a standalone designer, but it also settled the Yves Saint Laurent brand on solid ground. Yves was a great designer in his own right, but now he had developed a brand that was putting out 2 haute couture lines and 2 pret-a-porter lines each year. They became known to fans of fashion as being reliable, stylish, and of the highest quality. Unfortunately, Yves' decision to support his entire audience rather than just the richest of the rich did not sit well with everyone. The YSL brand was repeatedly bashed by fashion critics, many of whom believed that Yves was spitting not only on the legacy of fashion as a whole, but he was also disrespecting the legacy of his mentor, Christian Dior. Yves felt the sting of their wounds, but he did not let their hate stop him. With every angry critic's review, he would simply double down, determined to please his audience, regardless of what his critics had to say about his designs. Thankfully, the public was eating him up. The world could not get enough of Yves Saint Laurent. His decision to make stylish work that was more affordable was a huge hit, and suddenly people were wearing his designs all around the world. By the 1970s, Yves was considered the most prominent designer in the fashion business, having become the undisputed expert on the needs of the modern woman. Regardless of how lavish or ornate his designs were, he never forgot that the clothes he made needed to be comfortable. After all, what good are clothes if you can't wear them? His status as the designer meant that his work often shaped the fashion world for years to come. When he started using shoulder pads and accentuating the shoulder-to-waist taper, suddenly that look was everywhere. His design shaped the look of entire decades, especially the 1980s. However, with this popularity came an incredible amount of stress, and Yves was definitely not getting any younger. His health began to deteriorate as the stress of designing 4 lines per year, as well as years of alcohol and substance abuse, began to take their toll on his body. At some events, Yves needed to be supported by the models as he walked down the runway at the end of the show. Still, he pressed on. His passion propelled him forward, and he continued to design new lines until his passing. After a short battle with brain cancer, Yves Saint Laurent passed away on June 1, 2008. He was given a Catholic funeral, and his services were attended by the likes of the former Empress of Iran, Farah Pahlavi, Bernadette Chirac, Catherine Deneuve, as well as French President Nicolas Sarkozy and his wife Carla Bruni. After his death, his home where he was raised in Oran was restored and transformed into a museum dedicated to his memory. It has been open to the public since July 2022. Around 400 of his sketches are on display there, as well as period furniture that has been recovered and restored, keeping the house almost exactly as it was during the French designer's childhood. Yves Saint Laurent never stopped facing adversity throughout his career. He also never stopped overcoming adversity. Throughout his entire life, he continued to persevere, never forgetting that his loyalties were to the everyday woman and not to powerful men in ivory towers. This understanding and appreciation of the average person has elevated him forever beyond just a simple fashion designer to a champion of style and comfort for everyone. If you liked this episode, you should check out one of the recommended videos on the screen. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.